People still talk about what happened at Old Watchfield Hospice on the edge of a quiet suburb near Birmingham, where the houses thinned out and the road gave way to fields and a line of dark trees. The building had once been part of an old hospital, but over the years it had been turned into a hospice, a place where people went when there was nothing more the doctors could do. At night, it looked almost empty from the outside, just a few yellow windows glowing against the dark. Inside, though, the corridors never truly slept. Low lights hummed, machines beeped now and then, and the smell of disinfectant and worn carpet hung in the air. Emma worked the night shift there. She was used to the quiet weight of those hours, walking up and down the long halls while most of the town around her slept. Her world was soft-soled shoes, clipboards, plastic cups of water, and the steady rhythm of checking on people who were closer to the end of their lives than the beginning. Death did not shock her anymore. It was part of her job, like the sound of the rain on the hospice windows or the whir of the air vents in the ceiling. One stormy night, not long after she had started keeping the night shift regularly, Emma was looking after an older man named Harold Miles. He was thin and pale, but still bright in the eyes, still strong enough to laugh at small jokes. The doctors had said he might have weeks left. In a place like Watchfield, that sounded like a long time. But after a late, quiet shift where he seemed stable, Harold slipped away in the early hours, much sooner than anyone had expected. His breathing had grown rough, then simply stopped, as if someone had gently turned off a machine. Emma stood by his bed after they covered him with a sheet, listening to the muffled patter of rain against the glass behind the curtains. The room was still, but the memory of a small detail nagged at her. A few days earlier, Harold had been unsettled by something he claimed to see at the window. At the time, she had brushed it off as a side effect of pain medicine. Now, the timing felt strange. Without quite knowing why, she pulled out her small notebook at the nurse's station and wrote down the day and time he had first mentioned seeing children outside his window, then the time he died. When she drew a line between the two, she saw there were 3 days in between. It looked like nothing, just numbers on a page, but she found herself staring at them longer than she meant to. Old Watchfield carried stories, passed between staff over late cups of coffee and half-hearted snacks at 2 a.m. People said that patients near the end sometimes saw things, lost relatives, bright lights, or strange shadows in the corners of rooms. Most of the nurses treated these stories as part of the job, like the creaks in the floorboards or the way the wind made the windows rattle on bad nights. There was even a dark little joke some of them shared about the 3-day window, the idea that if someone claimed to see something odd at the glass, they would be gone within 72 hours. No one ever explained where the joke started, and no one liked to talk about it for long. As the weeks went by, Emma began to notice a new detail in what some of the patients said. It was not just shapes or faces anymore. A pattern crept in, small at first. A woman in another room, Joan Parker, mentioned children outside the window late one night. The description felt uncomfortably familiar. 2 small figures just beyond the glass, too still for real children, watching with the patience of something that did not get cold or bored. Emma checked, saw nothing but the dark reflection of the room and a faint orange circle of a car park light, and pulled the curtains closed. She told herself it was a trick of the shadows and Joan's tired mind. Still, she wrote the time down in her notebook. Joan died 3 days later, in her sleep, without any sudden change in her condition to explain it. Again, Emma marked the dates. Again, the line between first sighting and time of death came out to 3 days. With 2 entries, the page still looked almost empty, but the pattern inched from coincidence towards something else. Emma did not speak about it to the doctors. It sounded foolish in her own head, yet she could not bring herself to stop writing the notes. Each time someone mentioned children by the window, she found her pen in her hand before she even thought about it. The building itself seemed to hold its breath at night. Long stretches of corridor stayed half-lit, with the rooms on each side filled with slow, labored breathing and the steady ticking of clocks. The hospice had a history that went beyond its new paint and rearranged furniture. Older staff, like Mrs. Patel, the night cleaner, remembered when the place had been part of a larger hospital. They talked in quiet voices about things they had heard back then. Stories of strange children in the halls, glimpsed at the end of a ward and gone in the blink of an eye, and of patients who complained of small hands tapping at their windows just before they died. Emma had always treated those tales as old nurses' folklore, something people told to give shape to the many deaths they saw. Now, with her notebook filling slowly, she was not so sure. The autumn days grew shorter, and by the time Emma came in for her shift, the sun was already down. The world outside the hospice turned to a mixture of gray and black, with only the occasional passing car lighting the road. One heavy, clouded evening, a new kind of sadness arrived through the front doors. An 11-year-old boy named Daniel was wheeled in, pale and thin under his winter coat, his parents walking beside the chair with tired, red eyes. Daniel had spent most of his life in hospitals, in and out. Watchfield was meant to be a quieter place for him, a place where the machines were fewer and the voices softer. Emma got his room ready, checked his medications, and tried not to let her feelings show on her face. A child in a hospice bed always felt different from an adult, even in a place where death was normal. Yet Daniel did not cry or complain. He lay in his bed, small against the white sheets, looking past Emma at the window as the sky outside turned from dull gray to deep, featureless dark. Later that first night, when the corridors had settled into their usual hush, Emma walked past Daniel's room and glanced in. He was still awake, eyes fixed on the glass. From where she stood, she could only see the reflection of the lamp over his bed and a faint smear of lights from the car park. There was nothing there, nothing her eyes could catch. Still, a quiet unease stirred low in her chest. This was the same window where, in time, someone else might say they saw something. The thought rose unbidden and made her throat feel tight. At her small station desk, Emma opened her notebook once more. Under the names and times she had already written, she added a new line for Daniel. Not for a sighting, but for a question he had asked earlier in the evening, a question that did not fit the usual pattern. He had wanted to know about the children with dark eyes before he had even claimed to see them. It was as if he already knew the story, as if the legend of the little visitors had reached him before the hospice had. The page now held a thin trail of ink, names, dates, and the quiet suggestion of something moving just underneath the surface of normal, explainable life. Outside, the wind picked up again, rattling a loose sign somewhere along the outer wall. The building creaked softly as it settled in the cold. At the far end of the hall, beyond the pale pool of light around the nurses' station, the row of windows looked like dark, watching eyes. Emma closed the notebook and slid it back into her pocket. She told herself she was being silly, that she was just tired, that people died in hospices, and that was the only rule that mattered. Still, as she walked her next round, she found herself avoiding looking straight at the glass whenever a patient mentioned the night, or the way it felt like someone was out there, just beyond what they could see. The pattern, once invisible, was taking shape, even if she could not admit it aloud. In Old Watchfield Hospice, on those cold English nights, something had begun to stand at the windows, and whatever it was, it seemed to be counting down. Emma kept working her shifts, moving through those quiet corridors with her chart and her small notebook tucked into her pocket. On the surface, very little had changed. Patients still came in, some stayed for weeks, some only for days. Families arrived with red eyes and tired faces, then drifted away again, leaving behind rooms that smelled of flowers and antiseptic. The hospice hummed on. Yet beneath all of that, something else was taking shape, piece by piece, almost too slowly to notice. Her notes were never meant to be anything more than a private habit. At first, they had just been a way to remember. One patient who saw something strange at the window, then another. One death sooner than expected, then a second with the same 3-day gap in between. When she flipped back through the pages now, she could follow her own unease line by line. There were names, dates, and small, tight phrases about children outside. dark eyes, and asking to come in. Daniel's name appeared there too, written in neat letters. He was not like the others. He was a child, and that alone marked him out. But there was something else that set him apart. While most patients first spoke about the children after seeing them, Daniel had known of them beforehand, as if word of the hospice's strange visitors had reached him somewhere along his long path through other wards and waiting rooms. In the nights that followed his arrival, Emma watched him in the same quiet way she watched all her patients. She checked his breathing, his pain levels, the color of his skin. She changed his sheets, straightened his cables, and moved slowly around his room so as not to disturb him more than necessary. He spent long stretches of time looking at the window, even when the curtains were partly drawn. The reflection of his small, pale face hovered on the glass, with the dark outside pressing in behind it. The mood in the hospice changed with it. There had always been a gentle sadness in the air, but now a thin thread of fear wove through the staff's tired jokes and quiet talks. Emma noticed how some of the nurses began to pull the curtains closed faster in the evenings, not leaving them half open as they used to. Mrs. Patel, the night cleaner, started avoiding the windows altogether, walking down the center of the corridors as she pushed her trolley, as if the edges of the hall belonged to someone else. Emma began to see small things that made her question what was real. In the early hours, when the building was at its stillest, she sometimes thought she saw a shape standing very still beside a window at the far end of a ward. It was always just a little smaller than an adult, the height of a child. If she walked toward it, the shape would vanish, leaving only her own reflection in the glass and the faint glow of the outside lights. Once, as she wheeled a cart past an empty room, she caught the reflection of what looked like another pair of small figures behind her in the shiny surface of the metal. When she turned around, the corridor was empty. Emma tried to hold on to the normal tasks of her job. She told herself that focusing on the numbers on charts and the timing of medications would keep her grounded. Yet she could not keep her mind completely away from the notebook in her pocket. The thin pages had become a secret map of something that did not belong in a medical file. Each new entry took her one step further away from the simple story she wanted to believe, that people came to the hospice, were cared for, and died when their bodies gave out, nothing more. Daniel's place in that map became more important as the days went by. Unlike the older patients, who seemed surprised and frightened when the children appeared, Daniel carried an air of weary familiarity. He had lived in the world of hospitals for so long that the line between normal and strange had blurred. He had known other wards, other windows, other long nights with only machines for company. He had known pain as a regular guest, not a sudden intruder. To him, the idea of shadowy visitors outside glass panes did not seem to be a wild new fear, but an old one that had simply changed address. Nights in his room had their own rhythm. Sometimes he slept heavily, exhausted from his treatments. Sometimes he lay awake, eyes open, watching the square of darkness beyond the curtains. On those nights, Emma often felt a tightness in her chest when she stepped through his door. There was no clear reason for it. Everything looked as it should, yet the hairs on her arms would rise for no good cause, as if the room was listening to more than the usual sounds. Emma could feel that Daniel was holding back parts of his experience, as children often do, not to protect himself, but to protect the adults around him. She would see it in the way his gaze shifted when she came in, or how he would look past her shoulder at the window and then force his eyes back to her face. It was as though he did not want to burden her with whatever he saw there. Still, small clues slipped out. An offhand comment about not wanting the others to be alone. A tired remark about friends who come when the lights go off. She put these fragments together in her head, and they began to resemble a picture she did not want to see. Soon the 3-day pattern around the windows began to bend. Some patients who had never spoken about the children started dying within days of others who had. At first, Emma thought the link was broken, that her private theory had been nothing more than fear and coincidence. But she realized that something more subtle was happening. It was not just about individual people inviting the visitors to their windows anymore. The feeling in the building suggested that the hospice itself, with all its history and its steady stream of the dying, was being treated as a single large doorway. The old stories Mrs. Patel told her, stories of children in the corridors years before, when the place was still a hospital, came back to Emma in quiet moments. Emma's thoughts turned often to the idea of invitation. Again and again in her notes, the same detail appeared in different words. The children never forced their way in, at least not at first. They stood outside the windows, waiting to be seen. They knocked, tapped, or simply watched until a patient acknowledged them. It always seemed to be the patient who allowed them to come closer, even if that allowance was as simple as thinking of them as a comfort in the dark. Whether or not that moment had truly happened in exactly that way did not matter. What mattered was that the effect felt real in the hospice. The reach of the visitors had broadened. They no longer waited only at the windows. They seemed to move along the inside edges of the building, just behind the walls, slipping from room to room as easily as cold air. Patients stopped mentioning faces at the glass and started talking instead about feeling watched from the corners of their rooms or sensing someone small standing just out of sight at the doorway. Emma's notebook couldn't capture those feelings in neat lines, but it tried. Alongside dates and times, new words appeared. Doorway. Inside now. No longer just windows. The more she wrote, the more it felt as if she was charting the outline of something that was drawing closer, something that now saw her as clearly as she saw the people in her care. Someone had invited new players in, and they were no longer content to stand at the glass.